Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach, and I am thrilled, actually, almost literally thrilled to have once again on our program the quietly brilliant Brent Kievit-Kylar. And he's going to be a little bit less quiet, still brilliant tonight. He's an expert in cognitive science, and I believe a certain amount of other things. I believe, software and computer skills and so forth, but I'll let him introduce himself more. And we're going to be talking, he's going to be talking and presenting a paper he has been working on quite assiduously. And it's quite fascinating. And I'm going to, I guess, one quick intro is it's about the thing that we're not supposed to be talking about, but it's whether the thing is worse than the other thing, or perhaps better than the other thing, and which thing you should do about the thing, the thing. So, in the way of intro, why don't I'm sure that was a bad intro, but maybe you can do better.
That's tough. Yeah, so my background briefly, my educational background is a PhD in cognitive science. After that, I spent 4 years at Google. Most of that time, I was leading metrics analysis for image search, which is the second largest search property. For the last bit over 2 years now, I've been an associate director at a small biotech company doing biodiscovery, trying to find interesting new biological entities through DNA and search. So yeah, I think as Randy alluded to, we'll be talking about the thing, and so I did want to do just kind of a brief uh, talk before this. So last time Randy and I talked, we were talking about non-medical interventions, and I think people can get a bit bothered by that. But I think when we start talking about the thing, it gets a little bit more intense. In particular, I know that YouTube has just recently, put some more restrictions on what we can talk about with the thing. Um, so, I wanted to try to give this paper, and the goal of this paper is not to necessarily look at this from a science perspective, but to look at it from a big data perspective. So science, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen kind of further down the road and what might happen and what could be going on and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to try and stick as much as possible to the data that we have. Now, I will say that the data that we have, there's a lot of it that we would like to have that we don't have. So it's really kind of picking up bits and pieces of data from wherever those are available. I will try as hard as I can to just give you the analysis without the necessarily the arguments behind it. I'll let you kind of do that yourself. I'll just show you where the numbers lead, and hopefully try and kind of let you draw your own conclusions as much as possible. So if I don't do that, I apologize in advance, and hopefully we can stay on YouTube. Okay, you ready, Randy?
Yes.
Let's put up the paper that we got here. Okay. So again, as I've already said, I'm really going to try and focus on the data that we have. And I'm going to do this based on the saying that you may have heard that vaccines are safe and effective. So it splits down to these two different components. And I'll try and look at both of those components independently. So we'll start with safe and look at, what are the risks? Are there risks? How do they compare to the risks of what it's trying to prevent? And then later we'll look at effective. So, the interesting thing here is we are being told safe and effective for a reason, and it's because it really does have to be both of those. If either one of these tests fails, then this is maybe not the best choice and direction that we should go with. So we're going to look at both of these independently, but remember, you don't actually need both of these to be saying exactly one thing. If really either of these are at all convincing, one of those directions should be sufficient for at least rethinking, the direction that we're going down. So let's start with safe. What is safe? Well, safe is a very relative thing, right? There's lots of kind of activities. Is swimming safe? Is skydiving safe? Is climbing Mount Everest safe? How do we even get something to wrap our minds around in terms of what safety is here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at something called micromorts. So this is chances of dying out of 1,000,000. So the micromort comes from. And this gives us some way of trying to compare between different activities. Now, I'll also be referencing those micromorts back to actual activities so that they're grounded. So, what is 15 micromorts? Well, it might not mean much to you until we compare that back to some activity that you might have some more familiarity with. So I'll try and talk about it in terms of micromorts, but ground it back in terms of risks that you might be kind of more aware of. Now, I'm going to focus pretty much exclusively on mortality. And that's because it's kind of the clearest signal that we have. It just gets a lot more complicated if we look at other things. I will look at other effects, in particular, how they relate to mortality and look at the mortality rate of some of the other outcomes that you can have. But I'm going to try and stick mostly to mortality because it's kind of an apples to apples. If you want to talk about things outside of mortality, then it just gets harder because you have to now compare all this range of things between the two. And I think, you're basically going to end up with the same results. It's just, let's kind of constrain ourselves. So
can I give one quick point of order? I was wondering if you could go full screen and do Control++ a couple times, maybe make the print more legible in case people are on smaller devices.
Let's see, is that good?
Yeah, and maybe a little F11 or
document outline. Okay.
There you go. That's good enough. Thank you.
Okay. So the other thing that I want to talk about here is that there's a lot of data coming from lots of different places, and that gives us a lot of different ranges and places where we can be. So I'll try and talk a little bit about the upper and lower bounds for risk, and then we can kind of assume that maybe it falls somewhere between there. So let's start with our upper bound of risk. So to get our upper bound of risk, we can start with VAERS. So open VAERS shows 14,500 deaths. Now, yes, this is deaths with people who have had the vaccine. It is not necessarily deaths because people have had the vaccine, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a sec. But I'm not necessarily saying every single one of these deaths is because of the vaccine, and again, we'll look at these kind of in terms of upper and lower bounds. So that's the number reported. Now, there's two factors here. One is the mortality that might not be due to the vaccine. That's going to kind of lower that. And then there's going to be the underreporting. So how do we get a sense of the underreporting? Well, there was a Harvard study showing that VAERS only shows about 1% of the adverse events, but this is, clearly not going to transfer for all adverse events. There might be 1% reporting for sniffles, but there probably isn't going to be only 1% reporting for mortality.
Can I interject a quick question? I apologize.
Yeah.
So let's presume that amongst the vaccinated group, you have more oldsters, and amongst the unvaccinated group, we have more youngsters. If you're seeing side effects and so forth, and not necessarily from the vaccine, but people dying with the vaccine, you're talking about an older age group which has more mortality. So would you necessarily be able to continue any conclusions from seeing the vaccinated group to the, say, yet to be vaccinated group, given that they are younger and presumably healthier and less likely to die? That is to say, are we looking at the worst of the bunch, as it were, the people more likely to die anyway because they're more fearful, they're more likely to jump in and get the vaccine early on?
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of age, especially myocarditis is the big one that is anti-age correlated. So that is, if you're younger, it definitely appears like you have much higher mortality rate.
All the data is going to be age segregated and factored in. Is that my presumption?
Yes, in particular when we get to the COVID mortality. But yeah, right now we're just trying to look at kind of the upper worst case scenario, and then we'll kind of dive into that in a little bit of detail.
All right, sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so 1% is I think above even a reasonable ceiling for us to take. But I feel like I've generally seen kind of a 3 or 4 times seems to be what people at fairs themselves actually believe is a reasonable undercounting for mortality. So that would bring us to a ceiling of 58,000 with just under 200 million vaccinated. That gives us about 300 micromorts. So what is 300 micromorts? Well, it's somewhere between giving birth and boxing. So again, this is kind of aggregated right now across all age groups. We'll dive into specific age groups later, but you know, boxing and giving birth. So that's some risk, but it's not an absurd amount of risk, even for a higher bound. But we'll look at what that really means later. And we can, validate this with a few other countries that are going to be in the 50 to 100 micromort range as well with their raw data. Again, you have to balance for both overcounting and undercounting, which gets a little bit tricky in terms of how you're really going to do that. So let's switch over to the lower bound risk. So this is going to define the lower end of where this mortality really could be, and we're going to use as pretty much as strict as we possibly can, the risks that are accepted by the CDC as specific instances of things. So if we look at that, I'm going to break it down into these 4 parts. First, we have TTS at 13 per million. And if its mortality rate, which is around 33%, this will give you 4 micromorts just from TTS. Myocarditis, again, this is averaged across all ages. We'll look at that for individual ages later. Gives you about 10 per million, 50% mortality rate in 5 years, gives you about 5 micromorts. And Guillain-Barré syndrome at 22 per million with a 10% mortality rate gives you another 2 micromorts. So we've got about 11 micromorts with these 3. And then severe anaphylaxis seems to be pretty prevalent, but I don't know how to really get a mortality from that. But it is almost 300 per million. So we're looking at a lower range easily within 10 to 15. And this is really kind of the accepted floor. This is what the CDC is willing to kind of accept is actually part of the vaccine as far as I can tell. So, what is this too? Well, it's not that much, but actually first we'll look at a few more. Well, I guess, what is it? It's swimming or playing a game of football. So, that's not a huge risk, right? That's something that I think most of us are pretty willing to do. And I guess I have a few more validations for this number making some sense. We have the seasonal flu vaccine is around 0.5 micromorts. So this is, really, really, really small. And if we look at maybe a 30 times difference between the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine, which is the difference in prevalence within all the other things within the VAERS database, although this is just for flu and not for the 30x difference is actually for all vaccines, but it still gets us into that same sort of ballpark. Another way that we can look at this to find a floor is in Japan specifically, they broke down the mortality between Pfizer and Moderna, and they actually showed very, very, very low mortality for Moderna. So if we assume that Moderna is actually doesn't actually have any mortality rate associated with it. So if we assume,
okay. Could you maybe go back a sentence? I think we stalled on your computer end there. You kind of phased out for a little bit. It looked like Star Trek.
Are we in Japan then?
Maybe just go back 2 sentences or so. Maybe half a paragraph or something.
Okay, so back to the flu vaccine.
I think a little bit right after that.
Okay. Just getting a sense of what a reasonable mortality is based on knowing that the flu vaccine mortality is about 0.5 micromorts, which is generally accepted. And if we apply a 30 times multiplier, we get back into our 15 micromorts range. And that 30 times multiplier is, again, looking at the difference in the VAERS database for mortality from all vaccines versus the COVID vaccine. So just another way to validate a floor of this kind of 10 to 15. And then the other validation that I wanted to do was from Japan. So within Japan, they broke down their mortality from Pfizer and Moderna. and they showed almost no mortality at all for Moderna. So if we accept that was the mortality for Moderna, and we say that Moderna actually had no mortality, so all 11 of these were someone who died with Moderna instead of from Moderna, then that gives us a floor percent of how many people would have died, right? So we can use that if we assume Moderna is the floor, then we can look at how many people died with Pfizer, and all those who were over that 11 from Moderna, again, once you adjust for the vaccination rate, that would be people who died above and beyond that. That would be excess, right? Unless, because there isn't any reason to think that reporting would be different for people who had Moderna versus Pfizer.
Right. Yep.
So there's a big argument that with VAERS, the reporting is very different for the COVID vaccines versus the others because COVID's such a big thing. We're all paying attention to it. But this is a way to kind of try and get around that because we're comparing Pfizer and Moderna, which should
vaccinated
have
people
similar,
with vaccinated people. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So with that, we're at 33 micromorts. So again, we're kind of in that ballpark for our lower range again. Okay. So 15 to 30 is kind of our lower range. 300 is kind of our higher range for the immediate, assuming that we're trusting the data that we have to a reasonable extent. Just kind of gives us some bounds to work with.
So just to clarify, to reiterate for our audience, that's 30 out of a million. So 1 in 33,000, is that right?
3. Yeah.
So 1 in 33,000 would be the worst case scenario, and that would be the best case scenario. And the worst case scenario would be 1 in 3,000.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
But as you mentioned earlier, that is very different depending on your age. But let's say, so that's not terrible, right? I mean, again, we were looking at what that compares to, and it's kind of swimming up through, giving birth. That's kind of our range. Yeah, right. But let's look at the other side of this equation, right? So this is supposed to be protecting us from COVID itself. So how dangerous is COVID? Well, with COVID, we know it's extremely important to know what your age bracket is to see how dangerous it is. So we'll start with the 30 to 40-year-old range, and then we can kind of expand from that. But from the 30 to 40-year-old range, from the CDC case surveillance, we get a case mortality rate of 600 micromorts. So if you're a case, you tested positive, you have symptoms, this is your risk of death. But we want to know what your actual risk of death is a priori. So we have to do some adjustments. So first, we want to get the infection fatality rate. So that's if you're infected with COVID, what is your risk of death? And this is different from your case fatality rate because not everyone who's infected gets tested. Not everyone who's infected becomes a case. So how do we estimate that? Well, last time we talked a bit about this, and it's usually going to be stereoprevalence type things, and these are usually somewhere between 5 or 10 times more infections than there are cases. So let's stick with 7 for now. The next thing we're going to look at is false positives. So when we are looking at mortality with the vaccine and mortality from the vaccine, we recognize that there was a difference there. There's a difference there for COVID itself, and there's also a chance that you don't actually have COVID, even if you died having COVID, because the test is not accurate. So let's take both of these separately. First, we know that the PCR test has about a 2% false positive rate. And when you adjust per prevalence of COVID, that's going to mean that if you test positive with a PCR test, there's about a 50% chance you have COVID and a 50% chance you don't have COVID. So we're going to use...
You mentioned Bayes rate fallacy. It's also the homonym Bayes theorem, the Bayesian.
It is, exactly. Yeah.
It's funny that it's Bayes and
Bayes and Bayes.
Yeah. Yep. I'm going to interject while I'm talking. Just when you talk about COVID versus the vaccine, there's a joke that comes to mind. It's not much of a joke, but 2 data scientists, very exacting types, walk down the street towards each other, and one says, "Hey, how are you?" The guy says, "Compared to what?"
Yep.
Anyway, so that's always the question with vaccines. It's
Compared
like,
to what, right?
compared to what?
Yeah. So now we're looking at the other side of that, what we're comparing it to. So we had the chance that you test positive but don't actually have it. And then we also have the chance that you do actually have it and you die, but you didn't necessarily die from COVID. You just died with COVID. And, there's lots of different ways that you can get an estimate of that. Kind of, I think, a lower frame that we can get is about 50%. And this is justified by some results in Massachusetts where they actually went and looked at individual cases at some point and saw that they were overcounting by about that much.
Well, just to interject slightly, that's
Mhm.
kind of a special case of counting differential, because that's the nursing home,
Yep.
and a lot of times there's politics depending on which part of COVID it was, whether you want to say there are more or fewer.
Yes.
Um, so I'm not sure how that. What I didn't really remember to check the date on that article when I was looking at it. Um, but there are political, public health has the word public, which kind of corresponds with political, and there are sometimes interests at play of whether you want to claim something is or isn't, depending on whether you're in line to be at fault for one number or the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, these things are pretty hard to estimate, but what we'll find is it actually doesn't matter too much as long as we choose vaguely reasonable numbers.
Hmm.
Um,
Right, because
so,
we're just kind of getting ballpark here.
yep. Okay, so the last thing that I want to get here is we have people who have already been infected with COVID. So 42 million cases. If we use our 7x multiplier before, that means that about 90% of the population already has been infected, and with a reinfection rate of less than 1%, that results in a 90% reduction in mortality now relative to mortality earlier on for anyone in the general population, because they're much more likely to have already been infected and therefore not be able to be infected again. And actually, look at this. I gave it a 1%, so we'll adjust that. I think I might have adjusted all these, but again, it's actually really not going to matter that much. So if we take our 600 that we started with, divide it by 7, divide it by 2, divide it by 2, divide it by 10, we're going to get I guess it's probably going to be 2 micromorts for a 30 to 40-year-old, which is significantly smaller than our number above. Now, this is going to depend for an individual, of course, on one, have you individually been infected with COVID or not? And are you individually at higher risk based on other underlying conditions? But overall, it seems like we're going to be at maybe a 2 or so micromorts versus a 15 or so micromorts, and you can decide what that means to you. I will leave that as an exercise.
So it's not 0.23. Is that an error?
I'm pretty sure that I just missed all of my decimals here. But again, it's, easy enough to change.
Okay.
And this is still giving us that 60-year-old is going to be at about 18 micromorts relative to our 10 to 15 micromorts. So we're, as a 60-year-old, we're kind of ballpark there. Once we get up to the 70, 80-year-olds, now we're in 500 micromort territory, and now you have 500 versus an upper bound of immediate mortality of 300. So again, you can also make what you will of that. But again, there's the age gradation for COVID mortality. There's also an age gradation for side effects from the vaccine. So especially myocarditis, which is one of the big ones, for a 12 to 25-year-old male group, and this is directly from the CDC, 6 million doses, 3 million people, 360 instances. Given our 50% mortality rate at 5 years, that's 60 micromorts just from myocarditis alone for the 12 to 25-year-old range. And then for the 30 to 40-year-old range, it's closer to about 10 micromorts. But definitely some differences in numbers between these two things that, again, you can draw your own conclusions from. Okay, let's skip out of the safe part to the effective part. So we want the vaccine to not harm us. That's a good first step. But we also want the vaccine to do what it says on the label and reduce our risk, infection risk and mortality risk. I'm again going to stick with just the mortality aspect of it. So we're going to look at how much can it reduce your mortality risk. So I've split this into a few different sections based on different places where the data came from. The first one, I think I might have talked through last time on the show, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's looking at the actual vaccine trial data itself. And the weird conclusion that you get here is based on the false positive rate of the test, if you accept that this was a double-blind study, the results that were gotten should not have been possible even if the vaccine was 100% effective, just due to the false positives that you would get. So this is
I'm just gonna clarify that point a little bit for the audience, because this is a point I struggled with at first. I think you made it clearly, but cognitively it was a little bit tricky for me.
Yep.
So what I got from this rereading it is that your population you pick for the test, they are part of the population. It's kind of like when you impanel a jury, you're picking people, but they're still people. They're in a jury, but they're also part of society at large. So in this case, they're picking people for this vaccine trial, a little bit like a jury, and they're impaneling them, but they have some background rate of having been exposed or not to COVID and whatever date and time and place that was. So wherever it was, there was some COVID going on, or else we wouldn't have been testing for vaccine for it. And they had an underlying background possibility of having had COVID or not. And when you test the general population, so kind of the comparison group is the general population, and based on a certain amount of false positives and a certain amount of people having the illness coming in, you will get a baseline rate of a couple percent, because there are always going to be some false positive. The tests are imperfect, so you're putting the test out and you're checking something, and about one time out of 50, it's going to say it's positive when there was nothing there. So there should be a background rate of positive tests. And then in the experiment, when they did with this group, you're saying that they actually had fewer positives based, so the efficacy, so they gave them the vaccine, and then they looked to see if people turned positive, but the rate they had was lower than you'd expect even from the background. Am I anywhere close?
Yeah, so the experimental group had fewer people who were cases and test positive than we would expect there to be cases that tested positive but didn't actually have COVID in the control group. And that shouldn't be possible unless there's something weird going on in terms of either people knowing that they were in a group and changing how they were reporting, or some really weird things like maybe the COVID vaccine reduces your probability of testing positive, even if you don't have COVID, but that's a real stretch to get there or anything. So, it's pretty challenging to explain how we could have gotten these results given, what we have.
So you're left with the possibility. You're left with the possibility that there was a little bit of.
So I think there's two really potential outcomes. One is that there was some hokum going on with the experiment, and the other was that people who got the vaccine knew that they were in the vaccine group, because there's basic side effects. You get pain in the injection site, you're probably out for a few days. They knew they were in that group, and therefore they acted differently. In particular, they probably were less likely to report symptoms. And then that's something that you then have to consider going forward. If that's what happens, if people who got the vaccine are much, much less, 5 times less likely to report COVID-like symptoms, you have to take that into account later on in your analysis of the general population.
Because they might have some symptoms and attribute it to the vaccine.
or they might have some symptoms and be like, oh, that's just the flu. It can't be COVID because I'm safe because I'm vaccinated,
Right.
right?
So kind of a somewhere between a nocebo and a placebo.
Exactly, right. So it's just, something to keep in mind in terms of, it's a randomized controlled study, right? So that should be our gold standard for being able to, figure out what was going on here.
Or
So
unless there was some parts
unless
where the researchers
did something
confided,
or
like they
it was
basically
not
gave the test score away the way some
double blind.
teachers. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So this is, I'm honestly hoping that this is just an impact of de-blinding the study, because that means there wasn't anything nefarious going on. It was just kind of a poor experimental design. They probably shouldn't have injected saline, but something that would have maybe mimicked symptoms. I think they have done that in the past, but anyway, that's what we have for the actual vaccine trials themselves. But let's skip over to a few more data sets because I don't want to take too much longer. So the next data set I want to talk about is Brazil, and Brazil is very unique in terms of the data that they provide. They are really the only country that has provided a very comprehensive data set on COVID cases and COVID mortalities. They have a line for each person, and they have a huge amount of information that is actually, at least in theory, I guess, verifiable. I of course haven't gone in and verified that these people are who the data says they are, but I think it would be extremely challenging to fake this data set because it is so comprehensive, massively more comprehensive than any other country. So let's take a look at what happens when we analyze this. So first of all, I'm going to look at only the mortality data within it, and I'm going to do it on a day-by-day basis. And I'm going to get the mortality amongst the people who indicated that they were vaccinated versus those who indicated that they were not vaccinated. And you can see our two little graphs here. So our blue line is our vaccinated, and our red line is our unvaccinated. But the first thing that we have to do is account for the fact that the percent of people within the general population who are vaccinated are not changed over time. So we're going to adjust for that right here. So now we get the adjusted, so the frequency of mortality based on the frequency of vaccination within the population. So we just divided by the vaccination rate on a per day basis. And now we get this, where our blue line is the vaccinated and our red line is our unvaccinated. And we can plot that as the difference between this. So what this chart is showing is for this period here, the percent of people within the population who were vaccinated died from COVID at a rate 3 times greater than the people who died in the population who were not vaccinated. Now, there are caveats with this. As you can see at the beginning, it's much higher, and this is exactly what you would expect if the vaccinated and unvaccinated population are not equivalent, which of course they're not, right? Most countries started by rolling out to people who were older. They rolled out to people who needed it more, right? Who were in had higher comorbidities and all that sort of stuff. So what we see at the beginning is exactly what we would expect, that we had higher mortality amongst the vaccinated at the very beginning because the people who are getting vaccinated were just already at higher risk. So this part shouldn't be terribly surprising. But the fact that we do kind of normalize to about this 3 until we get to the end, and now again, the end, we can see that was just kind of towards the end of their wave and the end of their data, because it takes time for data to come in. So I don't know how much we can really trust exactly the details about what's going on towards the end here. You can see a little bit of up, and there is definitely some going down, but this 3 times higher is definitely a little bit concerning. I did look a little bit about comorbidities amongst the vaccinated population and unvaccinated population who died of COVID. Unfortunately, I didn't have those numbers for the general population, so there's only so much that I could go in. So you could come up with a hypothesis here still that the vaccinated were also more likely to have, well, they weren't more likely, the vaccinated in general were more likely to have comorbidities. You'd have to kind of do some really weird things to explain some of this, but it's definitely an interesting
let me
finding.
try one weird thing. So I've looked at a lot of the COVID mortality data sets in the U.S. and Israel and so forth, but there's a huge spread in in fatality rate, unvaccinated. I think it's it's about 10,000 times greater for your nursing home people than your 20-year-olds. And within individuals, if you're a healthy 5-year-old and an unhealthy 85-year-old, it might even be higher. So again, if this isn't really age adjusted and or disease adjusted, I think there might be some issues, because clearly, the people in a place like Brazil, which I don't think has penetrated vaccine rate to the same extent we have, or places in Europe and so forth. I have not checked that today. You're still probably talking about the population that is more health concerned for one reason or another. They looked at their driver's license and they realized they're 65 or as opposed to 25. And there's probably a kind of a penetration issue there. So I'm just going to put that out there. I don't know if you
Yeah.
addressed that.
Yeah, so I did actually redo this for only people who were over 50. Now the
Oh, thank
problem
you.
is I can't renormalize it because I don't know the vaccination rate of the over 50s across
Hmm.
time. But the curves are almost identical at this level. But again,
Hmm.
that doesn't account for the fact that the vaccination rate of the 50-year-olds across time may be significantly different. And I just unfortunately don't have that data, so I can't really normalize for it.
Okay.
But I do think that that is a valid point, and I think that the vaccination rate is lagging a little bit for the full population because it's I think it would probably bring this down a bit. Yep.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, Brazil actually has, I think, gotten fairly well vaccinated post facto. I think they're up to like 70% now.
Yep.
But back in what are the dates you're looking at here? Um, back in March and May and so forth, I think they were down around 20% or so forth. Let me just try May. In May, they were about like 5% had 2 doses and 15% had 1 dose. In
Yep.
June, they're up to the double. I don't know, maybe uh, 15 and 20, so forth. At any rate, now they're
Now they're
they've
pretty
kind
high.
of they've passed their wave and so forth, so the data is
Yep.
kind of be skewed.
Yep.
I'm yeah.
Yep. Okay, looking at a few other data sources, the UK, they have their technical briefings, and you can take a look at that. And they do show a slight win for the vaccinated, kind of maybe a 20% reduction in mortality. CDC's classic Cape Cod, which is why all the vaccinated people are suggested to wear masks, was showing, a slight increase relative for the vaccinated. But I actually wanted to just do kind of this one last thing, which I find to be particularly interesting. Um, so one other thing that I tried just recently is for all the data from our World in Data. Basically, what I did was I found the current vaccination rate for each country, and then I took the mortality, that is the daily mortality, and I by uh, frequency, so that is per million population. And then I summed it within each quarter of 2020 and 2021. So I had, Q2 2020, how many mortality for each country within that, and then Q3 for 2020, and so on up to Q3 for 2021, which isn't completely complete, but pretty close. And then what I did was I tried to do some correlations there. So here are raw correlations between the mortality for each of these quarters with the current vaccination rate within those countries. And we see that for every single quarter it's positive. Now, that's not because the vaccine is causing anything, because this happened way before the vaccine rollout happened, right? So the causal relation can't be in that direction. But I do think it's possible, although it is a correlation, so we can only talk about kind of the possibility here, that the correlation is actually valid in the other direction. That is, countries which had higher mortality earlier on were more likely to have more vaccines later on, because either the people were scared or the government was scared. Either way, it was pushed stronger. So the important part about that is that we would expect then that the countries which have higher vaccination rates, which had higher mortality early on, would have lower mortality later on. And the reason for that is, if you had higher mortality early on, it probably meant you had greater spreads. You had more people who have natural immunity. It means that you had more people who died already, who had really high risk, aren't available to die later on. So, there's a number of reasons that you would expect it to go down by itself, right?
Yep. Except for James Bond, you only live twice or something.
Yeah. So first of all, we do still see a positive correlation even in Q3. So all else being equal, we are seeing that countries which had higher vaccination rates also have higher mortality rates in Q3 of 2021. But this may just be an artifact of, again, some spurious extra correlation, because maybe...
Okay, I'm going to put one out.
Yep.
The average age in, say, sub-Saharan Africa is much lower than the average age in Europe.
Yep.
So Europe, I'm going to make a huge leap here and say that every country in Europe has a higher vaccination rate than every country in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep.
But people are in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're, they for lots of other reasons, they don't die from COVID. Either they haven't had it, it's outdoors, tropical, the weather, it's warm, and so forth, and so they're unvaccinated and they're not dying.
Yep.
Whereas Europe has much more variations in temperature, weather. They've got harsher weather. They've got older people. They're monitoring. They're checking. They have the money to check every day, and the Congo doesn't.
Exactly. So this is why it's important for us to look instead at the quarters themselves, at the change between the quarters. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the mortality for each country in Q3 2021, and we're going to subtract the mortality of that country in 2020. So we're going to see, how well they did as a starting point, and then how that changed. Did it go up or down, or how much, right? So we're going to take a look at that instead, and now we get this lovely graph. So here along the x-axis, we have the vaccination rate of each of the different countries. And along the y-axis, we have the change in mortality rate from 2020 Q3 to 2021 Q3. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and 1,000 means what on the left?
1,000 is a little complicated here. So what it means is the sum over all of the days in the quarter of the mortality rate per million. So it's not a nice measure, which is why it doesn't have a label.
Okay, so let's just leave it. So what does up mean versus down here?
So up means that mortality was higher in 2021 than it was in 2020. And down means that mortality was lower, right? So Peru had the worst first wave of anywhere. And then their second wave wasn't as bad, right?
So like my two data scientists who meet on the street, compared to what? So they had they had an annus horribilis, to quote Queen Elizabeth, the first year. So anything's better than that.
Yep.
And the other countries didn't really have that kind of severity. And so pretty much everybody is near zero, either bunched near zero or slightly worse. And as you go up in vaccination rate to the right side, you're seeing that countries don't necessarily go downward, which is where you'd want them to be.
Yeah, so if vaccines were causing a reduction in mortality, we should see a nice diagonal here.
Right, a down, up from the left down to the right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can do a correlation here. And it turns out actually to be effectively zero. This isn't positive, this isn't negative, this is noise. So really what that's indicating is that the prior mortality rate within the country is actually by far the strongest predictor of the post mortality. So your mortality in 2020 is really basically defining your mortality in 2021.
So there's nothing new, except death and taxes. I mean, the only thing guaranteed are death and taxes. And so people are still dying. That's what you're
Yep.
telling me. That now I'm not going to be able to sleep knowing that. Um, but at any rate, that's a joke.
Yep. Yeah. So, it's a correlation. So it's not proving a causation. Definitely can't prove a causation. But you can use a correlation to significantly show the lack of likelihood of a particular causation. So if you have a particular causal theory, and you see the correlation as 0 or the correlation not showing that, that does put a dent in your causal theory at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about where I want to end it. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think there's a little bit more, but it's not really my analysis, just looking at some kind of wrap up stuff.
Interesting. So just a kind of a procedural question here. If people wanted to read this on their own, is that going to be a possibility?
It probably will at some point. I'm still working with Panda to decide what the best way to distribute this is. I will say there's also another thing that I made, which is learning to code with COVID, which I will also probably be finding a way to get out. And what this does is, for that last analysis that we did with all the different countries doing the correlation, this will actually lead you through step by step. How do you collect the data, do all the processing, use Python, use Google Sheets. It's a tutorial lesson to teach you how to do some of this kind of analysis yourself. It'll show you, step by step, you can try different things. If, you want to restrict by age, you can do that. If you want to filter by different countries. So I chose for the data that I showed, only allowing countries that had 10 million or more citizens. If you want to try something else, if you want to compare against different quarters, you're free to do that. This will teach you how to kind of get started with all of that and make that happen.
That's interesting. I think totally separately. I'm a little bit struck with the thought of Tom Brady teaching me how to throw a football, and then I'm going to go play in the NFL. I mean, I think you're a Tom Brady for crunching data, and other people may try this, but they probably need a little bit coaching from you. I'm a sideline. You might have a business, teaching people, or starting a course or something like that, Coursera or whatnot. I think that's a good point. But speaking of points, my friend Fran asks the point. I think he wants a kind of a take-home message. How would you summarize what you've said? And I understand we're just doing correlations, not really for you to make pronouncements. But what's the take-home message here?
So the take-home message here is that the data is really messy all over the place. We saw a huge range for looking at the mortality. We see a huge range in terms of all of our analyses for the effectiveness. That's weird. It's not great. And I think that there is data that we could have that could give us more answers. I think that there is analysis that's happening that is not as open as we might like. And that's part of why I've really tried, and I do intend to make this a series where, even if you can't necessarily learn from the way that I did it, I want to make it as absolutely explicit as possible, exactly what I did. So you can try it yourself, and get what you get.
I'm going to take your, the papers down for a second so we can just chat.
Yeah.
But I see you as not a preacher with your own message. I see you as a kind of a ferry or vehicle that's carrying something that is out there, but you're also refining it as well. I could probably come up with some other examples. Maybe you're getting the rough diamond, and you know where to slice it to show what's inside, or a geode or something like that. But I'm gonna give my attempt at your message, and I apologize in advance. So my thought is that at the end of the day, it's just, silly expression, but at the end of the day, um, there's been a lot of talk about this and that, about vaccines and so forth, and how good is it? So I'm going to give my prejudice first. My prejudice is that I think it's really awesome to have a vaccine so quickly, and it's awesome that it was done, and it's really a kind of a high technical feat to do it this well, and it's an organizational feat, and all that. And I think it's kind of an awesome thing for oldsters. And I haven't, I've said on the program, my 90-year-old mother-in-law is in the basement. We would let her out if she wanted to go, but she stays there year after year, and she's hugely worried about this. And she wants a booster. Fine, I'm all good with that. She has, very little short term, unless she has, some Tom Brady's genes, um, and uh, and then there's a whole range of other people's gradations and so forth, where the vaccine's a hugely reasonable thing, especially for people who worry, they want to hedge their bets, and their personality traits that get layered on. Again, this is my prejudice. I think it's bad as dogma, and I think it's bad as one size fits all, and I think it's never one dose fits all that kind of stuff. And then as you get down for the lower age groups, that is not necessarily showing through. What I did kind of, filter out from your messages that, with micromorts and so forth, that it's a hard case to present that you're hugely better off at younger age groups from getting the vaccine versus not. I don't think you want to say that necessarily, and your data is there just to say what it is. But the kind of the meta message from what you're saying is that Brazil is presenting a lot of this refinement of data, but what about the other guys? Why aren't these other countries? Um, for a long time as a kid, I didn't realize my parents had a liquor cabinet. It was hidden away. I guess maybe they, I don't think they were big drinkers ever, but insofar as they ever did, it was maybe for a party or when we were in bed. And so it was a couple of years later, I happened to, open some drawer and there was liquor in it, whatever. Um, but if they'd wanted me to, to be part of it or know where it is or be warned about it one way or another, good, bad, they would have told me early on. They didn't do that because I'm a kid. I was 5, 7 years old, whatever. Who cares? But if I were involved in the household and paying my way, taxpayer and so forth, I'd want to know where some of the things are. And I just don't think that a lot of countries are. And this is my own experience in presenting some of these shows. I don't think a lot of countries really grade segregate the data by age groups, by risk factors, and all that kind of stuff. So you're not really seeing a good data set. I think that speaks to some of the problems you're having and some, but all that being said, this is more an applause section, an appreciation section. I think it's really incredible that the kind of the coding you've done with COVID, and be able to kind of show that at the end of the day that a lot of countries from hugely disparate, comparing Kazakhstan and Malaysia and whatnot, that when at the again at the end of the day that countries are tending to congregate towards this median in respect to vaccination and whatnot, which what does that all mean? I think there's a lot of different things it could mean. I don't think we're necessarily going to touch on all those or solve them all. So, I kind of put the ball in your court at that point. I suppose that wasn't a quick summary either. If I had to give a one-line summary, it would be to re-listen to this show maybe once or twice, stop at various points. But at the end, what I think you're going to come away with is that there isn't a huge, overwhelming benefit seen through the data, solely through the data, in vaccination versus not for the median age groups of various countries. Kind of the working parts of their country, not the old and infirm.
Yeah, I think these days we really like to see things in extremes in black and white, and one size fits all for everyone. And the interesting part is the interesting part, right? There's always really interesting complexities in the middle, and that's where you want to be looking. So I think this is complicated. I am not always right. I clearly was off. Had a decimal point off. So it's hard. But I think it really we need to put the time in. We need to be able to talk about this. We
right.
need to
So
be able to
this
talk
would
about
be
this
nice.
freely.
CDC stands for Centers for Disease Control, but if we kind of change it around a little bit to coding data, COVID data coding, you could be the CDC, and you'd probably do a much more forthright job. If we are in, people call it a democracy. It's really a constitutional republic with democratic rights. So people get to vote on things. But, in order to have anything like that work and not just be kind of top-down bureaucratic, expert overreach, you need an educated public. And so the places where the public is being at least given the opportunity to be educated, I think are countries that are showing more respect to their populace, to their voters. And when things are being withheld, then you have to wonder why. It's toys for them. Again, my parents' liquor cabinet, they were adults, I wasn't, so forth. So I get that. But if you're like the kid in the room and you're not being treated as a co-equal adult, and you are theoretically a co-equal adult, I think that's kind of, speaks to issues which, need addressing. We've seen a lot of scenes from Australia. This is, again, political. I don't want to taint your show here, but there's clearly one group that seems to know it all, and the other group that is being treated very poorly. And I don't think the know-it-all group has anything close to the assimilation of data and configuration that you were able to present in this hour. So I recommend all of Australia watch you, and every other country on Earth as well.
So again, for any of the viewers, if you see anything in here where you think I got it wrong, I would be happy to have a constructive adult conversation. I've been trying to encourage this with everyone that I've talked to about this. I don't want this to be one-sided. I'm not just telling you. I really want to open a dialogue and say, this is what I'm seeing. How is what you're seeing different, and how can we figure out where that difference is coming from? Please be nice to me.
All right. So I'm going to give you one quick recommendation. I think there was some kind of bandwidth issue. So sometimes the video slowed down. Maybe when we go over that, you might provide some of the captions in case any were lost. So with that, I'm going to thank our guest, Brent Kievit-Kylar, and I thank all of you who listened to this. Please spread it widely. Neither of us are doing this for recompense. We certainly, would like you to, take the time and appreciation to present this to anybody who should be listening to it. And I think that, it's really awesome work you did. And if we divide the work by the money you've made from it so far, you are infinitely talented and very much in my appreciation zone. So thank you so much. I'm going to end it unless you have some last words.
I'm good. Thank you very much, Randy.
All right, perfect. Hope to talk to you soon. And good night, everybody. Share this, give us likes and advice and suggestions. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.